When the Rampart scandal hits, the Biggie investigation team becomes the Rampart investigation team, basically. They get moved into that. So here's avalanche effect of Rafael Perez Alonso from Training Days creating this Rampart scandal himself by getting caught. Maybe people attempted murders, definitely robbing people, selling drugs in the Rampart division. He throws the whole LAPD into an uproar. People get moved off the Biggie case into the Rampart case, and that's why it languishes.
We have reason to believe that Officer Nino Durden testified falsely about the alleged narcotics transactions and that he witnessed and may have planted rock cocaine on this defendant.
Go like, share, and subscribe. So you may have heard the name Psycho Mike. It's pretty insightful into the mess that the LAPD made of the Biggie case for sure. And it might be indicative of policing in general, but definitely here in LA. Psycho Mike is important because he's the person that put it in the air that there was a hitman named Amir Muhammed, Nation of Islam hitman, and he was hired by Suge Knight through David Mack. David Mack was Rafael Perez Alonso from Training Days' buddy. David Mack pled guilty to robbing a bank for $722,000. Psycho Mike was a longtime LAPD informant. He went to prison for murder, and while he was in prison, maximum security, according to him, he joined the BGF, the Black Guerrilla family. And in the year 1985, the Black Guerrilla family was appearing in a lot of newspaper articles in Los Angeles. Again, the theatrical flourish of Los Angeles law enforcement. They were promoting in different articles the idea that the BGF was trying to take over via murder the drug trade, the retail drug trade in black neighborhoods in LA. And there were a variety of homicides that maybe were linked to them or not, depending on who was convicted. But in 1985, Psycho Mike starts writing letters to the LAPD. And what they were about was an unsolved murder of a cop. A sheriff who worked at the jail in downtown LA. He gets off work. He gets in his van to go home. He's getting onto the I10 Expressway. Everyone knows that goes east and west through LA. And there had been a guy hiding in a van, pops up, kills him on the highway. So, of course, he crashes. Assailant stumbles out of the car, bloody, runs off. And it's an unsolved mystery of law enforcement. Of course, this is high profile. So they start getting these letters from this guy, Mike Robinson, saying that it was the BGF. And they had put a hit out on this guy because this particular sheriff, he was in a shootout with some other law enforcement with the BGF. It must have been the George Jackson prison escape in 69, 70, where several law enforcement were killed. And this guy, Arthur George, he survived. And supposedly he was killed by the BGF as retaliation because some of the BGF were killed in this shootout. So Psycho Mike gets out, and for 14 years he's helping LAPD work this unsolved mystery of a sheriff killed by the BGF. In the meantime, he's getting get out of jail free cards because, mind you, he's a convicted murderer at this time. I don't know the intricacies. It probably was a drug issues. Of course, he was schizophrenic. That's why he's called Psycho Mike. And one particular cop he sort of was tight with was this guy, Richard Valdemar, who has a blog. And he appears on the different Gangland and any type of crime show about the Mexican Mafia or the Bloods and Crips. And I think his blog is called In the Hat. He claims he's in the hat. He's supposed to be a hit, supposed to be on him from the Aryan Brotherhood or Mexican Mafia. Maybe it is. I don't want to make light of that. But he is one of those law enforcement that takes these cases and weaves them into these grand conspiracies. He worked a big cocaine conspiracy case out of Pasadena in 87, the infamous Ray Ray Browning case, who was BGF, got a big cocaine conspiracy, and the BGF guys, they had money from drugs. One of them supposedly linked up with the guy Peabody that started the UBN So that's where the Bloods, UBN, BGF nexus kind of comes from. But this is back in the 80s. So in the meantime, Psycho Mike is out. BGF's in the news. They supposedly killed people in Pacoima and Nickerson Gardens to try to take control of the drug trade. Newspaper stories, not saying they're true or not. He is working cases, including he helps get a bunch of people out of the Nickerson Gardens public housing, bounty hunters, indicted for drugs and guns. I think in the late 80s, early 90s, 40-some people went to prison. So he's getting this reputation as this great informant. But frankly, telling the police there's people selling drugs and have guns at the Nickerson Gardens in the 80s, I don't think that was any secret. Another case he did was a white biker who was building bombs. Well, when the police went over Psycho Mike's apartment, just a random thing, this idiot biker lived across in the apartment building across and would leave his blinds up, and out of Psycho Mike's window you could see this guy building a bomb. So I don't think Psycho Mike was any great informant, even though in Labyrinth, the book that the Johnny Depp movie City of Lies is based on, which is Johnny Depp's kind of playing a character based on Russell Poole, who's deceased now, who originally worked the case before Greg Keating got it. And then when the Rampart scandal broke, which again, remember, go back to our buddy Rafael Perez, Alonzo from Training Day, when he got in trouble himself, shooting people illegally, stealing and selling yayo there in the Rampart division, he smokescreened his own actions by cutting a deal where he claimed up to 100 officers, many of whom were exonerated. Most of them were, or I think almost all of them were.
Some rise by sin, and some by virtue fall, as well as we intimidate those who intimidate others. To those mottos, I offer this. Whoever chases monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster himself.
And he negotiated himself a 16-month plea. He only did 16 months. He didn't even go to prison. He stayed in the LA County jail for safety purposes. Biggie murder happens and stuff's unsolved. Psycho Mike gets word to him. And again, Psycho Mike at this point is a known great informant. He knows who did it. It's a guy named Amir Muhammed. And he's a Muslim hitman. And he throws out some other names. He said he worked for a drug dealer named Gardner Bay, who's part of this Muslim mafia. But there's, LAPD say they have no records of Gardner Bay. He's not in the newspaper article anywhere. There's no one I know ever heard of him. Not that I know everybody, but he says it's Harry Billups, a.k.a. Amir Muhammed. So this is that drawing, that composite sketch that keeps getting shown, and people say, oh, that was the hitman that killed Biggie. Of course, then there's other people that say it's Wardell Poochie Faust. This is what Reggie Wright and Greg Keating promote, who's been dead since '03, who it's highly unlikely did it, but I'll talk about that in the Logger story. Gene Deal, the most, by far, and only real good witness and believable, because Gene Deal, Puffy's bodyguard, not Biggie's bodyguard, but he was there that night at the Peterson guarding Puffy, and by extension Biggie somewhat, but he was specifically guarding Puffy. Gene Deal had a full-time job as a New York State parole officer that he never gave up. So to be a parole officer, at least in New York, you get a lot of training. Because parole officers, they're supposed to keep up with their parolee. What are you doing? That's an investigation. They can go into houses, look around. What's this? It's criminal paraphernalia. So he's almost sort of like to some degree, a trained detective as a parole officer. And he gave all, sketches of who we thought the guy was, which doesn't really look like Amir Muhammed. It sort of does. He just said he had on that same blue shirt and a bow tie. Even a bow tie on does not make you a member of the Nation of Islam. Psycho Mike is the one who says it was Amir Muhammed, Harry Billups. The police look at David Mack's visitor log from when he was arrested, and the first visitor he gets is someone who signs in as Amir Muhammed. Now, Harry Billups, who is now the last people knew he was selling mortgages in Atlanta, and he wants no part of this. I don't blame him. I mean, whether he's guilty or innocent, he sure don't want to be associated with killing Biggie. He was college roommates with David Mack, the corrupt Rampart cop who robbed a bank, who may or may not have worked with Rafael Perez at death row. We really don't know for sure. There's pictures of them at parties. David Mack's dressed in red, and he did grow up in Compton. Don't mean he did a hit for Suge Knight. David Mack had been an Olympic-level athlete. He qualified for the Olympics in '84 when it was in L.A., ironically, but he got injured and he couldn't compete. And Harry Billups was just David Mack's college roommate, going to check on his buddy who got arrested. I don't know. Is it odd he went to visit him in jail and signed in under a different name with a different social security number? It is, but we don't know the nature of their relationship. But in Greg Keating's book, he says something else. And I know I'm telling you to take all these cop stuff with a grain of salt. It's not that Greg Keating and Russell Poole, I think, make anything up or consciously lie. I think that they make mistakes. Whether willfully, I'm not going to attribute it to them willfully, maybe just subconsciously, they're letting themselves weave a tale that lends itself to a book. Remember, Greg Keating and Russell Poole each put out books. Labyrinth, Murder Rap. I think Russell Poole's team put out another book after he died. Keating, I think, has another coming out. Keating was a consultant on Unsolved. Poole's book got made into a movie. Both of these guys made substantial money and still are. So Poole really thought Harry Billups, Amir Muhammed, was a hitman. When the Rampart scandal hits, the Biggie investigation team becomes the Rampart investigation team, basically. They get moved into that. So here's avalanche effect of Rafael Perez Alonso from Training Days creating this Rampart scandal himself by getting caught, maybe killing people, attempted murders, definitely robbing people, selling drugs in the Rampart division. He throws the LAPD into an uproar. People get moved off the Biggie case into the Rampart case, and that's why it languishes. And Greg Keating replaces Russell Poole. He comes in to run the case. He doesn't think that Harry Billups, Amir Muhammed, was the hitter. In fact, Keating in his book said something really interesting. He brings up this guy's Stutterbox. Stutterbox, this is yet a whole nother crazy theatrical sub-story that's a whole documentary on its own. A Whack 100 and Stutterbox went back and forth on the internet recently. Stutterbox was an FBI informant. He told the police he had some information, and he talks to Keating, but they don't believe anything he says. They give him a lie detector. He fails, but he fails it so miserably they can't even tell what he's lying about. And Stutterbox had a fake ID in the name of Amir Muhammed back from 1995 with this face on it, predating any mention of Harry Billups being Amir Muhammed. Was Stutterbox the shooter? Or was Psycho Mike just pulling the name Amir Muhammed out of thin air? Maybe he didn't pull the name out of thin air. I think he lied about seeing Harry Billups at a party, a stripper party in Compton, and asked him, "Did you kill Biggie?" And he said, "Yes." That doesn't sound too plausible. And now let's close. Remember I told you those story about him helping solve the murder of the deputy, that it was the BGF? Well, in 1999, it comes out that the sheriff was killed by another sheriff. It was a lover's quarrel. One was messing with the other one's wife or something, and he hid in the guy's van, shot him, got away, and was never a suspect, and then moved to Spokane, Washington, and unalived himself as the noose was closing in 99. So Psycho Mike's whole entry point into being tight with the police, which he milked for 15 years, was made up out of cloth. He was sitting in prison and started writing letters. Oh, it was the BGF. Smart guy. He played the police for a long time. And then he died at the age of 49 of general poor health, I guess. But he was machine gunned outside of the Knickers and Gardens. And, of course, Richard Valdemar and Keating say, or Poole, like, oh, well, that's proof someone was out to get him because he was talking about the Biggie case. Well, unfortunately for the residents of the Knickers and Gardens, lots of violence happens there year after year after year. Standing around the Knickers and Gardens could be hazardous to your health in general. I mean, the first 9 months of 2021, there were 9 homicides on the grounds of Nickerson Gardens Public Housing Project. There's only about 3,000 or so people that live in there. And he had participated as an informant in a big case involving people from out of there at an earlier date. So I don't know why they think that proves someone shot him for talking about the Biggie case. So, City of Lies indeed. Why are these police officers using these ridiculous informants? I've become someone who thinks the use of informants should be really reformed heavily. Now, of course, police will tell you, well, who do you want us to get to be witnesses in the murder at the crack house? The school teacher isn't there. They're right. I mean, you can't get rid of cooperating witnesses totally from the criminal justice system, but having ongoing informants whose profession is to always have something to tell the police in exchange, they never go to jail for whatever it is they're doing. They meet the police by writing letters from prison, and it all turns out to be made up. How dumb are these cops to be strung along for 14 years? Or maybe they don't care. Maybe, I think they didn't, well, I know for a fact, I'm not saying in this case, I don't know, but in many cases, informants are useful because the police may have illegally obtained evidence, or they want to put, maybe they're framing somebody or whatever's going on. They can put false information in the mouth of an informant, or if they got a murder weapon they want to get in, they can have the informant found it and turned it in. Informants are very useful. They have very little oversight. They're only being overseen by the police officer that's working them. So if that guy went sideways, or just is incompetent, or just is doing whatever that maybe would not be considered conducive to justice, there's no one to know.